Just after midnight on September 7, 1870, Captain Hugh Talbot Burgoyne stood on the bridge of Her Majesty's ship Captain, watching his deck disappear under black Atlantic water. 18 degrees of heel, wind at 60 knots, waves 50 feet high off Cape Finisterre, nearly 500 men aboard, most of them sleeping. The ship was rolling to starboard for the third time in 2 minutes. Burgoyne had won the Victoria Cross for valour as a young man. He had faced enemy fire without flinching, but the enemy he faced now was more terrifying than any human foe. His ship, the pride of the Royal Navy, the most powerful seagoing battleship in the world, was 6 feet 8 inches above the waterline. The ship she sailed alongside, HMS Monarch, had 14 feet of freeboard. That difference of 7 feet 4 inches was about to kill everyone aboard. 37 years old, decorated war hero, Captain Hugh Talbot Burgoyne commanded this ship. 51-year-old Captain Cowper Phipps Coles was also on that deck. The ship bore his name, not officially, but everyone in the Royal Navy knew Captain was his design, his vision, his obsession. For 14 years, Coles had fought the Admiralty, fought the naval controller, fought the chief constructor, fought anyone who said his revolutionary turret ship design was unsafe. He had gone to Parliament, he had gone to the press, he had gone to the public, he had won. They had built his ship exactly as he specified. Low freeboard for reduced target profile, massive rotating gun turrets mounting 12-inch guns, full sailing rig on tripod masts, the hurricane deck suspended above the turrets. Everything he demanded. Now, at 18 degrees heel with water pouring across the main deck, Coles realised his critics had been right. The Admiralty's chief constructor, Edward James Reed, had objected to every aspect of this design. Vice Admiral Sir Robert Spencer Robinson, the controller of the Navy, had raised concerns in 1866 when the design was approved. Both men had calculated the centre of gravity. Both men had predicted disaster. Both men had been overruled, not by superior technical knowledge, not by better calculations, by public opinion, by newspaper editorials, by questions in Parliament. Captain was built because the British public demanded it. The court-martial would later engrave this verdict on brass plaques in St. Paul's Cathedral. The ship was built in deference to public opinion expressed in Parliament and through other channels, and in opposition to the views and opinions of the controller and his department. That night, as Captain rolled past 18 degrees toward 21 degrees, past the point where her writing moment peaked, those words had not yet been written. But the physics that made them inevitable was already in motion. The story begins 15 years earlier, in the Crimean War. 1855. Captain Cowper Phipps Coles, then 36 years old, serving in the Black Sea, the British and French navies were bombarding Russian fortifications. Traditional naval tactics meant ships anchored broadside to the target, guns firing through fixed ports in the hull. Effective against other ships, ineffective against shore fortifications. Coles had an idea. He and a group of British sailors constructed a raft. They mounted guns on the raft. They protected the guns with a rotating armoured cupola. They named it the Lady Nancy. They used it to shell the Russian town of Taganrog on the Sea of Azov. The Lady Nancy proved a great success. The concept of protected, rotating guns could change naval warfare. Coles understood this immediately. After the war, he filed a patent on March 10, 1859, a revolving gun turret, armour plating in a cylinder, rotating on rollers mounted to the deck. Guns inside the turret could fire in any direction without the ship needing to manoeuvre. Revolutionary concept. The Admiralty ordered a prototype. In 1859. They installed it on the floating battery Trusty. Trials in 1861 were successful. The turret worked. The guns fired accurately. The armour protected the crew. Coles became famous. The press called him a visionary. Prince Albert, consort to Queen Victoria, wrote letters supporting turret ship construction. The public embraced Coles as the plucky inventor fighting bureaucratic resistance. But Coles was not satisfied with turrets on coastal defence vessels. He wanted ocean-going battleships with turrets, low freeboard to reduce target profile, full sailing rigs for extended range, and the heaviest guns the Royal Navy could mount. The Admiralty, specifically Chief Constructor Edward Reed, explained why this combination was impossible. Low freeboard meant waves washing over the deck in heavy seas. Full sailing rigs meant tall masts raising the center of gravity. Reduced stability plus low freeboard equals capsizing. Basic naval architecture. Coles rejected these objections. He was an inventor, not a naval architect, with minimal understanding of stability calculations. He believed his intuition was superior to Reed's mathematics. When the Admiralty approved construction of HMS Monarch, a turret ship designed by Reed with 14 feet of freeboard, Coles attacked Reed publicly, claiming Reed was a hidebound reactionary and that Monarch's design was inferior. Edward Reed was 33 years old when he became chief constructor in 1863. Young, brilliant, with deep understanding of naval architecture and engineering. He had designed Britain's first true iron battleships. He understood the physics of stability. He knew that low freeboard and tall masts were a fatal combination. When Coles submitted his single turret design in 1864, Reed reviewed the plans and wrote a devastating critique. The ship was too heavy, the freeboard was too low, the center of gravity was too high, the design would produce an unsafe vessel. Coles responded by going to the newspapers. The mid-Victorian era was a time when newspaper circulation was exploding and public opinion could pressure government institutions. Coles portrayed himself as the lone genius fighting Admiralty obstruction. Editorials in the Times supported him. Parliament raised questions. Why was Britain lagging behind America in turret ship technology? The American USS Monitor had fought at Hampton Roads with great success. The arguments ignored that American monitors were coastal vessels that did not cross oceans or carry full sailing rigs. In 1865, the Admiralty established a committee to study turret ship design. Coles declined to participate, claiming illness. The committee concluded that turrets were effective, but Coles's single turret design was impractical. They recommended a two-turret design with proper freeboard, which became HMS Monarch. Coles launched an aggressive campaign, accusing Reed of sabotage and Robinson of incompetence. The campaign worked. In January 1866, the Admiralty terminated Coles' consultant position. 1 month later, after protests from his supporters, they reinstated him and agreed to let him design his own ship as a private venture. If it succeeded, Coles would be vindicated. If it failed, the blame would fall on Coles and the private contractor, not the Royal Navy. Coles selected Laird Brothers' shipyard at Birkenhead. Laird Brothers had extensive experience building iron warships. They had built turret ships for Denmark, for Peru, for other nations. They submitted 2 possible designs in July 1866. The design called for 8 feet of freeboard. Reed and Robinson immediately raised objections. 8 feet was dangerously low for an ocean-going ship with full sailing rig. Robinson noted that low freeboard would cause flooding on the gun deck. Reed criticized the weight estimates and the high center of gravity, the First Lord of the Admiralty. At the time was Sir John Pakington, a political appointee with no naval experience. Pakington supported Coles. When Reed refused to approve the blueprints, Pakington informed him he did not have authority to refuse. Reed changed his approval to not objected to. A bureaucratic way of saying, I think this is dangerous, but I cannot stop it. The contract was approved November 18, 1866. Construction began. If you want to see how this experimental battleship performed when it finally put to sea, hit that like button. It helps us share more forgotten military history stories. Subscribe if you haven't already. We're bringing you detailed histories twice a week. Back to Captain. HMS Captain was laid down January 30, 1867 at Laird Brothers shipyard in Birkenhead. The specifications were ambitious: 320 feet long, 53 feet beam, design displacement 6,960 long tons. 2 turrets positioned fore and aft, each mounting 2 25-ton, 12-inch muzzle-loading rifled guns, the largest naval guns in service at the time. Steam engine producing 5,400 indicated horsepower driving a single screw. But the real controversy was the sailing rig. 3 masts, the tallest masts in the Royal Navy at that time. More sail area than any British warship then afloat. Coles insisted the ship needed this massive sail plan to achieve the speed and range required for a first-rate battleship. The masts created immediate problems. Traditional sailing ships had rigging that ran from the masts down to the main deck. Hundreds of lines, ropes, stays, shrouds, all of it necessary to control the sails. But turrets needed clear fields of fire. Rigging in the way would be cut to pieces when the guns fired. Other naval architects had solved this problem by placing turrets amidships with a flying deck above them. Rigging attached to the flying deck, leaving the turret deck clear. Coles rejected this solution. He wanted the turrets positioned fore and aft for maximum arc of fire. His solution was the hurricane deck, a complete platform deck built above both turrets, extending from bow to stern. All rigging attached to the hurricane deck. The turrets below had completely clear fields of fire in any direction. On paper, the hurricane deck was brilliant. In practice, it was a death sentence. The hurricane deck measured 40 feet wide and ran the length of the ship. It was built of timber and iron, supported by iron pillars rising from the main deck. The deck itself was 8 feet above the waterline when the ship was upright. When the ship heeled, the hurricane deck became an enormous surface catching wind. The physics were simple. A flat surface 8 feet above the water, 40 feet wide, 200 feet long, angled into a strong wind. The pressure was immense. Every degree of heel increased the surface area exposed to the wind. Every degree of heel pushed the ship over farther. The hurricane deck acted like a lever arm, amplifying the wind's force. Naval architects call this the windage problem. Every surface above the waterline that catches wind creates heeling moment. The higher above the waterline, the greater the heeling moment. The hurricane deck was positioned at the worst possible location, high enough to create enormous leverage, large enough to catch tremendous wind pressure. Coles either did not understand this or chose to ignore it. Construction proceeded through 1867 and 68. Coles was rarely present at the shipyard. He was in poor health. Some sources describe him as frequently bedridden. He sent letters with instructions and requirements but did not personally supervise day-to-day work. This was a critical failure. Laird brothers were experienced shipbuilders, but they were building to Coles' specifications. When problems arose, there was no one present with authority to approve changes. The design called for wrought iron armour plating 8 inches thick at the belt, 6 inches on the turrets. The armour weighed hundreds of tons. The 12-inch guns weighed 25 tons each. 4 guns 100 tons. The turrets themselves weighed over 100 long tons each. 200-plus tons of rotating armoured turrets mounted high on the ship. The hurricane deck added more weight. The massive masts and rigging added more weight. The steam engine and boilers added weight. Coal bunkers for fuel added weight. Every component added weight. The designers had estimated total displacement at 6,960 long tons. This assumed careful control of weight during construction. Instead, weight spiraled out of control. Iron plating was ordered slightly thicker than specified to ensure strength. Small change, but across the entire hull it added tons. The turret mechanisms were reinforced to handle the massive 12-inch guns. More tons added. The hurricane deck structure needed stronger pillars to support the masts. More tons. The steam engine installation required heavier engine beds than originally calculated. More tons. Coal bunkers were expanded to increase the ship's range. More tons. By the time Captain neared completion, she weighed 7,695 long tons. 735 long tons over design weight. 10% heavier than planned. This had catastrophic consequences. Ships float at a depth where the weight of displaced water equals the weight of the ship. Heavier ship displaces more water, floats deeper. Captain's designers had calculated she would float with 8 feet of freeboard. The designed waterline was carefully calculated to place the lower edge of the armour belt slightly above the water. The gun ports would be well clear of the waves. With the additional 735 tons, Captain floated 22 inches deeper than designed. The freeboard dropped from 8 feet to 6 feet 6 inches. The armor belt was now partially submerged. The gun ports were only slightly above the waterline. In any significant sea, waves would wash across the main deck. This was not theoretical. This was simple mathematics. But there was a worse problem. The center of gravity had risen by 10 inches during construction. The center of gravity is the point where all the ship's weight can be considered concentrated. For a ship, it is usually several feet below the waterline. The lower the center of gravity, the more stable the ship. Adding weight high in the ship, like the massive turrets and hurricane deck, raises the center of gravity. The 10-inch rise was the difference between a marginally stable ship and a catastrophically unstable one. When Edward Reed learned the final weight and freeboard numbers in early 1870, he wrote to the Admiralty. Captain was dangerously unstable and should not be commissioned. His letter was ignored. Reed had become a political liability, and Captain was already in service. Admitting the ship was unsafe would be massive public embarrassment. The Admiralty decided to proceed and hope Reed was overly cautious. This decision killed 472 people. Reed wrote again in March with detailed calculations. At 14 degrees heel, Captain's righting moment would be only 410 foot-tons versus thousands for a safe ship. Worse, her righting moment would peak at 21 degrees, then decline. Ships with this inverted stability curve could not recover from heavy rolls. Robinson agreed but had no power to stop operations. Captain's commanding officer was Captain Hugh Talbot Burgoyne, age 37. He had won the Victoria Cross in the Crimean War and came from a distinguished military family. When he took command on April 30th, 1870, nobody told him the ship was fundamentally unstable. Nobody showed him Reed's calculations. Nobody explained she could capsize if she heeled past 21 degrees. The Admiralty did not tell him because they did not want to admit they had allowed an unsafe ship to be built. The Admiralty ordered an inclining test at Portsmouth on July 29th. This test measured stability by moving known weights across the deck and measuring the heel angle produced. The results were damning. At 14 degrees heel, Captain's righting moment was only 410 foot-tons versus 60,500 for Monarch. Captain's maximum righting moment occurred at 21 degrees heel, beyond which the force declined. Monarch's increased all the way to 40 degrees. These calculations were not published until after the disaster. 472 lives would have been saved if the voyage had been cancelled. In August 1870, Captain sailed to Gibraltar as part of the combined Mediterranean and Channel squadrons. 11 capital ships representing British naval power. A diplomatic show of force intended to demonstrate British supremacy in the Mediterranean. The United States had recently emerged from civil war with a powerful navy. France had rebuilt its fleet after the Crimean War. Russia was modernizing its Black Sea fleet. Britain needed to show that it remained the world's dominant naval power. Captain was the newest ship in the fleet. She was also the most watched. The British public wanted to see if Coles's revolutionary design would prove itself against the conventional ships designed by Reed and other Admiralty architects. The press sent correspondents to cover the voyage. Newspapers ran stories about the magnificent new battleship with her innovative turrets and low profile. Nobody mentioned that professional naval architects thought she was a floating coffin. The fleet conducted exercises in the Bay of Biscay and off the Spanish coast. Captain performed well in calm weather. She was fast under sail, achieving speeds over 13 knots with a favourable wind. Her steam engine provided good power when needed. The turrets rotated smoothly, and the guns could be loaded and fired efficiently. Officers aboard other ships watched Captain with interest. She did look formidable. Low in the water, sleek profile, massive guns in armoured turrets. She looked like the future of naval warfare. What they could not see was the narrow margin between operational and catastrophic. In calm weather with light winds, Captain was stable enough. But stability is measured under stress. How does the ship behave in heavy weather? How does she handle when waves are washing over the deck? How does she respond when strong winds press on her massive sail area? These questions would be answered in September. Gunnery trials were conducted off Vigo, Spain in late August. Captain fired her 4 12-inch guns in a single salvo. The ship rolled heavily, 20 degrees to one side. The massive recoil had pushed the ship sideways. Officers aboard other ships watched in shock. HMS Monarch, also a turret ship, had fired her guns in earlier trials. Monarch rolled significantly less when firing full broadsides. HMS Hercules rolled even less. Captain was less stable than every other ship in the fleet, so unstable that firing her main battery pushed her to within 1 degree of her maximum righting moment. But the trial was judged a success because Captain achieved good accuracy. 3 of her 4 total hits came from the carefully aimed first salvo. The fact that firing those guns nearly capsized the ship was treated as a minor issue. The trial should have resulted in Captain being immediately withdrawn. Instead, it was treated as validation. This was willful blindness. Everyone wanted Captain to succeed. Nobody wanted to admit years of political battles had produced a death trap. September 6, 1870. The combined squadrons were cruising off Cape Finisterre, northwest coast of Spain. Cape Finisterre, meaning end of the earth in Latin, was feared by sailors. The Atlantic seabed rises rapidly here from 4,000 meters depth to less than 200 meters, creating enormous waves when storms roll in. The Spanish coast is known as the Costa da Morte, the coast of death. The Royal Navy knew these were dangerous waters. On September 6th afternoon, conditions were manageable. Force 6 winds, 25 to 31 miles per hour. Captain was making 9.5 knots under sail. She had her 4 staysail, 4 topsail and main topsails set. Moderate canvas for moderate winds. Captain Burgoyne was on the bridge. Cowper Coles was also aboard. Coles had asked permission to accompany the fleet to witness his ship's performance. He wanted to see Captain operating with the Mediterranean and Channel squadrons. He wanted to prove to any remaining skeptics that his design was superior. Admiral Milne had granted permission for Coles to observe from aboard Captain. This decision would cost Coles his life. Admiral Milne came aboard Captain that afternoon to observe her performance. What he saw concerned him. Waves were washing over her main deck with every swell. The ship was heeling noticeably. Milne was an experienced sailor who knew what a stable ship felt like. Captain felt tender, rolling easily and recovering slowly. After 2 hours, when the wind increased and Captain heeled perhaps 15 degrees, Milne summoned his barge and transferred back to his flagship without expressing his concerns to Burgoyne. He chose not to intervene, unwilling to create a political incident. This decision also killed 472 people. Throughout the afternoon of September 6th, the weather steadily deteriorated. The wind increased. The seas built. Rain squalls moved through. By evening, the wind had reached force 7 to 8, 32 to 46 miles per hour. The waves had built to 20 to 30 feet. Captain began reducing sail. Burgoyne ordered the crew to take in the upper sails, leaving only the lower topsails and 4 staysail set. This was minimal canvas, just enough to maintain steerage and keep the ship headed into the wind. In a storm, the safest position for a sailing ship is heading directly into the wind with minimal sail set. The ship presents her bow to the waves. The waves pass under the bow, and the ship rides over them. This requires constant attention. The helmsman must keep the ship pointed into the wind. If the ship turns sideways to the waves, she will roll. The more she rolls, the harder it becomes to bring her back on course. If she rolls too far, she might not come back at all. Night fell. The storm continued to build. By midnight, the wind had reached force 9 to 11, 47 to 63 miles per hour. These are hurricane force winds by modern standards. The waves had built to 40 to 50 feet. Mountainous seas. Other ships in the squadron recorded these conditions in their logs. HMS Monarch, sailing 2 miles from Captain, noted force 10 winds and 50-foot waves. Her log entry recorded that she was handling the conditions without difficulty. She had reduced sail to minimum canvas. Her deck was being washed by waves, but she remained stable. Her 14-foot freeboard meant that water coming over the bow drained quickly and did not accumulate on deck. Monarch heeled perhaps 10 to 12 degrees in the strongest gusts. Then she righted herself. Her captain noted in the log that the ship was behaving well, and he had no concerns about her safety. Other ships in the squadron reported similar conditions. The storm was severe but manageable. The wind and waves were well within the designed limits of properly built warships. This was important. The court-martial would later establish that the weather conditions on the night of September 6th to 7th were not exceptional. They were simply typical Atlantic storm conditions that any first-rate battleship should be able to handle. Cowper Coles was aboard. He had sailed with his ship to witness her vindication. For 14 years he had fought for this design. Now he was watching it struggle in conditions that the other ships in the fleet handled without difficulty. Shortly after midnight, a new watch came on duty. Most of the crew was asleep. The watch officers immediately noted Captain was heeling 18 degrees to starboard. They reported this to Captain Burgoyne. Burgoyne ordered the crew to drop the fore topsail and release the sheets holding both topsails angled into the wind. If they could let the sails flap loose, the wind pressure would decrease. The ship might right herself. The order came too late. Other ships in the squadron recorded wind speeds reaching 60 knots. Force 11 on the Beaufort scale, waves 50 feet high. Captain heeled past 18 degrees. Burgoyne and his officers knew what that meant. The inclining test had not been published yet, but experienced sailors could feel when a ship was reaching her limits. At 21 degrees heel, Captain reached her maximum righting moment. The physics that would kill 472 people were now in control. The roll continued, past 21 degrees. The hurricane deck, that innovative platform holding all the rigging, was now acting as a giant sail catching wind and pushing the ship over. The massive gun turrets, each weighing over 100 long tons, were high above the waterline, top-heavy. The low freeboard meant water was pouring across the main deck, adding weight high in the ship. Everything that made Captain revolutionary was now killing her. At approximately 00:15 hours, 7 minutes past midnight on September 7, 1870, HMS Captain rolled past her point of no return. Water surged through the gun ports. The ship capsized completely. Men trapped below deck had no time to escape. The turrets, those revolutionary rotating armoured gun houses that Coles had pioneered, tore free from their mounting rings as the ship inverted. Water rushed in. Captain sank in minutes. Survivors testified later that the ship floated upside down for 3 to 10 minutes before sinking. Her hull remained buoyant just long enough for a few men to cling to the keel. Then she slipped beneath the Atlantic. 472 men died. Captain Burgoyne died. Captain Cowper Phipps Coles died with his ship. The son of Hugh Chelders, First Lord of the Admiralty, died. The son of Thomas Baring, Under Secretary of State for War, died. The cream of the Royal Navy Officer Corps died. 18 men survived. One sailor, disturbed by the severity of Captain's condition during the storm, had taken it upon himself to cut the lashings securing the ship's launch. He climbed inside the launch under its tarpaulin. When Captain capsized, the launch was thrown into the sea. That sailor helped the other survivors aboard. Without his actions, there would have been no survivors. The news reached London on September 9th. The Times broke the story on September 10th. A dreadful calamity. The brand-new battleship HMS Captain, pride of the Royal Navy, had foundered off Cape Finisterre. In a dark and stormy night, without a moment's warning, the waves of the Atlantic had engulfed one of the noblest prizes they had ever snatched from human skill and courage. The Times noted that Captain Cowper Coles had died aboard the ship, which was the final result of his genius. He was, practically, the inventor of the greatest naval improvement of modern times. That sentence must have caused some at the Admiralty to choke on their breakfast. Many professional naval officers and architects had been deeply suspicious of this ship. They had tried to stop it being built. They had filed objections, they had raised concerns, they had been overruled. Now 472 people were dead, and the worst naval disaster in British peacetime history had occurred. A court-martial convened on September 27, 1870, aboard HMS Duke of Wellington in Portsmouth Harbour. Technically, the court-martial was of the 18 survivors, but in practice it was a technical inquisition into what had gone wrong. The proceedings lasted until October 8th. Officers from every ship in the combined squadron testified. They described wind conditions, they described sea state, they described captain's behavior in the hours before she capsized. Naval architects testified about stability calculations. The inclining test results were finally made public. The numbers were devastating. The court-martial reached several conclusions. First, Captain was capsized by pressure of sail assisted by the heave of the sea. Second, the sail carried at the time of her loss was insufficient to have endangered a ship with proper stability. Every other ship in the fleet handled the same conditions without difficulty. Third, before Captain was received from her contractors, a grave departure from her original design had been committed. Her draft of water increased about 2 feet. Her freeboard was diminished to a corresponding extent. Her stability proved dangerously small, combined with an area of sail that was excessive under those circumstances. Fourth, and most damning, the court deeply regretted that if these facts were duly known and appreciated, they were not communicated to the officer in command of the ship, or if otherwise, the ship was allowed to be employed in the ordinary service of the fleet before the facts had been ascertained by calculation and experience. The court-martial went further. They found that Captain was built in deference to public opinion, expressed in Parliament and through other channels, and in opposition to the views and opinions of the Controller and his department. This was an unprecedented rebuke of the British public. For years they had demanded Coles be allowed to produce his super ironclad. Now the court was saying publicly that public opinion had overruled professional expertise, and 472 people had died as a result. The verdict was engraved on brass plaques installed in St. Paul's Cathedral. A memorial was placed in Westminster Abbey with a stained glass window. These gestures were unprecedented. They have never been repeated for any other ship loss. The Royal Navy wanted the lesson to be permanent. Public pressure must never again overrule technical expertise when lives are at stake. The loss of Captain sent shockwaves through naval architecture worldwide. The immediate response was to improve stability calculations for all new warship designs. The Admiralty established the Committee on Designs of Ships of War in November 1870. This committee's mandate was to review all future naval designs before construction began. No warship would be built again without rigorous stability analysis verified by multiple independent calculations. The committee included naval architects, experienced sea officers, and mathematicians. Their task was to ensure that political pressure and public opinion could never again override technical expertise when safety was at stake. The concept of metacentric height became standard in all naval design work. Metacentric height is the distance between a ship's center of gravity and its metacenter. The metacenter is the point above which the ship's center of buoyancy shifts when the ship heels. If the metacenter is above the center of gravity, the ship is stable and will right herself when heeled. If the metacenter is below the center of gravity, the ship is unstable and will capsize. For Captain, the metacenter was barely above the center of gravity. The metacentric height was measured in inches, when it should have been measured in feet. This gave Captain almost no resistance to rolling. Once she started to heel, there was minimal force bringing her back upright. The Committee on Designs of Ships of War established minimum metacentric height requirements for different classes of warships. First, rate battleships must have a metacentric height of at least 3 feet. Second-rate ships must have at least 2 feet 6 inches. Third-rate ships must have at least 2 feet. These were not arbitrary numbers. They were calculated based on the forces that ships would experience in Atlantic storm conditions. A ship with proper metacentric height could heel to 30 or 40 degrees in a storm and still right herself. Captain's metacentric height had been less than 1 foot. She could only heel to 21 degrees before the forces reversed and pushed her over farther instead of bringing her back. The new standards meant that ships like Captain would never be approved for construction. Low freeboard designs were not banned entirely. Ships could still be built with modest freeboard if other aspects of the design provided adequate stability. But the combination of low freeboard, high center of gravity, and massive windage that had killed Captain was now explicitly prohibited. Naval architects had to demonstrate through calculation that any new design could survive force 10 winds and heavy seas without exceeding safe heel angles. The disaster also accelerated the end of hybrid sail and steam battleships. Through the 1860s and early 70s, most battleships carried both steam engines and full sailing rigs. This made sense when steam engines were unreliable and inefficient. Coal supplies were limited at distant stations. Ships needed sails to operate far from home ports. But steam technology was improving rapidly. By 1870, engines were becoming more reliable. Coal supplies were being established at naval bases around the world. The advantages of sail were decreasing, while the disadvantages were becoming clearer. Tall masts and extensive rigging raised the center of gravity significantly. On Captain, the masts and rigging contributed several feet to the center of gravity height. If Captain had been built without masts, with steam propulsion, only her center of gravity would have been much lower. She might have been stable enough to survive that storm. Naval planners recognized this. Within 10 years of Captain's loss, most new battleships were being designed as steam-only vessels. They might carry small auxiliary sail rigs for economical cruising in calm weather, but the massive masts and extensive rigging were gone. By 1880, the age of the sailing battleship was essentially over. The disaster that killed Captain accelerated this transition by perhaps a decade. The loss also changed how the Royal Navy approached public relations and political pressure. For years, Coles had successfully used newspaper campaigns and parliamentary questions to override Admiralty objections to his designs. He had portrayed himself as an innovative genius being suppressed by hidebound bureaucrats. The press and public had supported him. Parliament had supported him. The Admiralty had been forced to approve construction of Captain, even though professional naval architects knew it was unsafe. The court-martial verdict explicitly stated this. The ship was built in deference to public opinion in opposition to expert advice. This verdict was a stunning rebuke of public pressure on defense policy. The Admiralty used it to establish new protocols. Technical decisions about ship design and safety would be made by qualified naval architects and experienced officers. Public opinion and political pressure would not be allowed to override these technical judgments. If a design was judged unsafe, it would not be built regardless of public demand. This policy was not always followed perfectly in subsequent years. Political pressure still influenced naval policy. But never again would the Royal Navy approve construction of a ship that its own experts had explicitly declared unsafe. The memory of 472 dead men was too powerful. HMS Monarch, the ship Edward Reed designed and Cowper Coles had attacked viciously served for decades. She participated in the bombardment of Alexandria in 1882, where her heavy guns proved effective against Egyptian shore fortifications. She served as a harbour guard ship through the 1890s. She was finally sold for scrap in 1905, 35 years after Captain sank. Monarch proved that turret ships could be safe and effective if properly designed. High freeboard provided reserve buoyancy and prevented flooding. Proper calculation of stability ensured she could handle heavy weather. Conservative design that prioritized seaworthiness over minimizing target profile meant she could operate safely in the worst conditions the Atlantic could produce. Reed's design philosophy had been completely vindicated, but Reed's career still suffered. He had resigned from the Admiralty in July 1870, 3 months before Captain sank. He was exhausted by years of public attacks from Coles and his supporters. He was frustrated that political appointees kept overruling his technical judgments. After resigning, Reed worked as a private naval architect. He designed ships for foreign navies including Spain, Chile, and Brazil. Some of his private designs were excellent. Others were less successful. Reed also entered politics, serving as a Member of Parliament from 1874 to 1890. But he spent much of his parliamentary career criticising his successors at the Admiralty. He attacked their designs publicly, often unfairly. He became the same kind of obstructionist critic that Coles had been. This damaged Reed's reputation. He died in 1906, a bitter man who felt his contributions had never been properly recognised. Admiral Spencer Robinson resigned shortly after the Captain disaster, officially citing ill health. He was 62 years old and had served the Royal Navy for 45 years. Robinson had understood from the beginning that Captain was unsafe. He had raised objections to the design. He had supported Reed's technical assessments, but he had been unable to prevent the ship's construction because political pressure was too strong. Robinson retired to his estate and died in 1882. He never spoke publicly about the Captain disaster. His private papers, released decades later, revealed his frustration and sense of helplessness as he watched political forces push forward a design he knew would kill people. Hugh Chelders, the First Lord of the Admiralty, who had supported Coles and overruled Reed and Robinson, also resigned in March 1871, 6 months after the disaster. He claimed the resignation was for personal reasons. Everyone understood it was because his son had died aboard Captain. Childers returned to politics years later and eventually served as Chancellor of the Exchequer under William Gladstone. But the loss of his son aboard a ship that he had politically pushed forward haunted him for the rest of his life. Friends reported that he rarely spoke of Captain, but when he did, he was visibly distressed. He died in 1896. Cowper Coles died at age 51 with his reputation destroyed. Before September 7, 1870, he was celebrated throughout Britain as an innovative genius. Newspapers printed glowing profiles. Parliament praised his contributions to naval technology. The public viewed him as the heroic inventor fighting bureaucratic obstruction. After the court-martial verdict was published, all of that reversed. The press now portrayed him as an obsessive amateur who had refused expert advice and gotten 472 men killed. The turret system he pioneered continued to be used, but credit went to Reed and later naval architects who had developed practical, safe turret ship designs. Coles' insistence on low freeboard, his refusal to understand stability calculations, his public attacks on anyone who disagreed with him, all of it overshadowed his genuine contributions to naval technology. His family suffered from the stigma. His widow, Emily, received a small pension but lived in obscurity. His son, Sherard Osborne Cowper Coles, became a respected metallurgist and inventor of the Sherardizing galvanization process, but he rarely mentioned his father's naval work. The name Cowper Coles became associated with hubris and disaster rather than innovation. The name Captain was retired from the Royal Navy. No British warship has carried that name since 1870. This was an official decision by the Admiralty. The name had become cursed. It represented the worst peacetime disaster in Royal Navy history. It represented the triumph of political pressure over technical expertise. It represented 472 unnecessary deaths. The Admiralty wanted the name permanently retired as a warning to future generations. The decision was unprecedented. Famous ship names like Victory, Warspite, and Ark Royal had been reused many times over centuries. Even ships that had sunk in battle or been lost to storms had their names reused. Captain never was. The name became a black mark in British naval history, an albatross that nobody wanted to carry. For 93 years after the disaster, the story of Captain was largely forgotten or deliberately ignored outside of professional naval circles. It was too embarrassing. It revealed too much about how Victorian Britain's vaunted naval supremacy had been compromised by political interference. It showed how public pressure and media campaigns could produce catastrophic results. The British public preferred to remember Trafalgar and other glorious victories. They did not want to remember Captain. Historians wrote about the Monitor and Merrimac. They wrote about the Battle of Lissa in 1866, where ironclads fought each other for the first time. They barely mentioned Captain. In 1963, British journalist and naval historian Arthur Hawke published a comprehensive book titled HMS Captain. Hawke had spent years researching the disaster. He reviewed Admiralty records, court-martial transcripts, survivors' testimonies, and contemporary newspaper accounts. His book brought the Captain's story back into public consciousness for the first time in decades. Hawke's conclusion was blunt. The disaster was caused by political interference in technical decisions. Cowper Coles had been allowed to build an unsafe ship because he had powerful political allies and media support. Edward Reed and Robert Spencer Robinson had been correct in their objections, but had been overruled for political reasons. 472 men had died because Victorian Britain's politicians and public had refused to trust their own experts. Hawkey's book sparked renewed interest in the disaster. Naval historians began examining the case as an example of how not to design warships. Engineering schools used Captain as a case study in the importance of proper stability calculations. Political scientists used the case to illustrate the dangers of public pressure overriding expert judgment on technical matters. Modern naval historians view Captain as a case study in how not to design warships. The fundamental problem was that Coles tried to optimize multiple incompatible characteristics simultaneously. Low freeboard to reduce target profile, heavy guns in armored turrets requiring high mounting, full sailing rig requiring tall masts, fast speed under sail requiring large sail area. You cannot have all of these features on one ship. Physics does not allow it. Coles believed his intuition about ship design was superior to mathematical calculation. He was wrong. Edward Reed understood that ship design required trade-offs. You could have low freeboard and light guns, or high freeboard and heavy guns. You could have full sailing rig with moderate armor, or reduced sailing rig with heavy armor. But you could not have everything. Reed's designs succeeded because he understood these trade-offs and made informed compromises. Coles's design failed because he refused to compromise and rejected calculations that contradicted his intuition. The wreck of HMS Captain lies somewhere off Cape Finisterre, Spain. For 153 years, her location remained unknown. In 2021, Dr. Howard Fuller, a reader in war studies at the University of Wolverhampton, initiated the Find the Captain project. Fuller is a naval historian and fellow of the Royal Historical Society. His research focused on Captain as the worst disaster suffered by the Royal Navy during the Pax Britannica era. Fuller gathered a team of historians, marine archaeologists, and Spanish authorities. In August 2022, an exploratory survey off Cape Finisterre used a multi-beam echo sounder to scan the sea floor. The survey identified 4 previously unknown wrecks. The 4th wreck has a general configuration and dimensions closely corresponding to Captain. The wreck lies in 1,300 to 1,700 meters of water, nearly a mile deep. At that depth, there is little oxygen and no sunlight. Marine organisms that would normally destroy wooden structures cannot survive. If this wreck is Captain, she may be remarkably intact. Fuller continues to raise funds for a definitive identification expedition. Sir Gerard Cowper Coles, the great-grandson of Captain Cowper Coles, supports the project. The family wants the story told properly. They want the 472 men who died to be remembered. They want the wreck site treated with respect as a mass grave. The lessons from Captain remain relevant today. The most important lesson is that public opinion is not well informed about defense policy. Technical expertise must not be overruled by political pressure or popular demand. Captain provides an unusually stark example, but the pattern repeats. Throughout the last 150 years, political objectives have been allowed to override sound defense policy, always to regret. The second lesson is that intuition and confidence do not substitute for calculation and testing. Cowper Coles was confident his design was safe. He believed so strongly that he sailed aboard her on her final voyage. His confidence was irrelevant. The physics did not care what he believed. The third lesson is that warning signs must be heeded before disaster occurs. Multiple people warned that Captain was unsafe. Reed calculated the stability problems. Robinson raised concerns about the design. The inclining test results showed dangerous instability. All of these warnings were available before Captain sailed into that storm. They were ignored because admitting the ship was unsafe would have been politically embarrassing. 472 people died because embarrassment seemed worse than cancelling a voyage. The story of HMS Captain is the story of the worst battleship ever built, but it is more than that. It is a story about the dangers of overconfidence. It is a story about the price of ignoring expert advice. It is a story about how technological innovation without proper understanding of fundamental principles can produce catastrophe. It is a story about nearly 500 men who boarded a ship believing it was safe, trusting that their officers and their government would not send them to sea in a death trap. They were wrong to trust. The government had sent them to sea in a death trap because political considerations outweighed safety. When Captain rolled past 21 degrees heel in the early morning of September 7, 1870, physics took over. No amount of courage, no amount of seamanship, no amount of prayer could save them. The ship was fundamentally unsafe, and everyone with technical knowledge had known it. They had known it when the design was approved. They had known it when construction began. They had known it when she was commissioned. They had known it when she sailed. And they had done nothing to stop it. If this story moved you, if it made you think about the importance of listening to experts and the danger of overconfidence, do me a favor and hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you forgotten military history 3 times a week, real stories about real people and the lessons we still need to learn. Drop a comment right now. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you've ever visited Cape Finisterre or if you've served in any navy. Tell us what you think about the balance between innovation and safety. Your comments keep this community alive. This is not just history. This is a warning about what happens when we ignore mathematics, ignore experts, and let confidence override calculation. 472 men paid the price. Their names are engraved on brass plaques in St. Paul's Cathedral. Their wreck lies a mile beneath the Atlantic off the coast of Spain. Their story deserves to be remembered, not as a curiosity, but as a permanent reminder that physics does not negotiate. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure the crew of HMS Captain is not forgotten.